The certified mail notice was sitting on my doormat when I came home from what had to be my 9th job interview in 3 weeks. I almost stepped on it. I remember thinking it was another piece of junk mail, maybe a credit card offer or a coupon book from the grocery store down the street. But then I saw the orange slip tucked underneath it, the kind the post office leaves when something requires a signature, and my stomach dropped before I even picked it up. It was from the bank. 5 days. That's all I had left before they would begin the formal repossession process on my truck. I stood there in the narrow hallway of my apartment complex in Raleigh, North Carolina, still wearing my interview blazer, still holding my portfolio under my arm like any of that mattered anymore, and I just stared at that letter. My name in bold print, the account number I knew by heart, the figure I owed, and then that word at the bottom, in plain bureaucratic language that somehow hit harder than anything dramatic ever could: delinquent. My name is Aaron Pruitt. I was 28 years old, and until about 4 months before that moment, I had a job I was actually proud of. I worked as a project coordinator for a mid-size commercial construction firm here in Raleigh. It wasn't the kind of job that made people's eyes go wide at dinner parties, but it was mine. I had built it from an internship I took the summer after I graduated from NC State, stayed late when nobody asked me to, learned the software nobody else wanted to learn, earned 2 raises in 3 years. I had a routine. I had a paycheck that hit every 2 weeks like clockwork. I had a truck I was making payments on, a small apartment I could afford, and the quiet, unremarkable stability that I used to take completely for granted. Then the firm lost a major contract. Then a second one fell through. Then there were layoffs, and I was on the wrong side of the number they needed to cut. And just like that, everything I had carefully built started coming apart at the seams, faster than I knew how to stop it. Unemployment helped for a while. Not enough, but something. The problem was that the construction industry in the Triangle had slowed down in ways I hadn't anticipated, and every application I sent out felt like dropping a stone into a well and never hearing it hit the bottom. 2 callbacks that led nowhere. 1 second interview that ended with a polite email saying they had decided to go in a different direction, weeks blurring into other weeks. The truck payment I missed once, then twice, then 3 times, while I kept telling myself the job was coming. The job was almost here, just hold on a little longer. 5 days. I sat down on my couch that evening and did the math I had been avoiding doing for longer than I should admit. The truck was worth more to me than just transportation. I lived 20 minutes outside the city, and public transit out here was not built for someone trying to get to interviews in office parks and industrial corridors. Without the truck, I couldn't get to work. Without getting to work, I couldn't pay for the truck. The circle was so tight it made me feel physically sick. If you've ever felt that particular kind of quiet panic, not loud, not dramatic, just this constant low-level static in your chest that never fully goes away, then you already know what the next few days felt like for me. I kept applying. I kept rehearsing answers to interview questions in the mirror. Because I had read somewhere that it helped with confidence. I made coffee in the mornings and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, and tried to approach it like a job in itself. Tried to stay disciplined and hopeful, and then I'd close the laptop at night and lie awake staring at the ceiling wondering if I was just fooling myself. By day 3, I had started pricing out used bikes online. Not because I thought a bike would solve the problem, but because I needed to feel like I was doing something while I waited for an answer that wasn't coming. That afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My family was back in Greensboro, my mom, my younger sister, and they didn't know how bad things had gotten because I had been careful, maybe too careful, about what I shared with them. I figured if I could just get through this on my own, there would be no reason to put that weight on anyone else. I opened the door and found my upstairs neighbor standing in the hallway. His name was Walter Fenn. I had lived in that building for 2 years, and I knew him the way you know someone you see every few days in a shared space. Enough to nod, enough to hold the elevator, enough to exchange a few words about the weather or football scores. He was in his late 50s, a quiet man with the kind of deliberate way of moving that suggested he had once done physical work and still carried it in his body. He had retired about a year before, from what I understood, though I had never asked from what. He was holding a small tool bag and a casserole dish covered in foil. He said he had noticed my truck hadn't moved in a few days, and since he was heading downstairs to fix the loose hinge on the building's laundry room door, he thought he'd stop by and drop off some food his wife had made too much of. I remember my first instinct was embarrassment, the specific sharp kind that comes with being seen when you don't want to be seen. I started to say I was fine, that everything was good, that it was just a weird week. But Walter didn't leave. He just stood there in the doorway with this patient look on his face, the casserole dish in his hands, and something about the way he waited, without pushing, without making it strange, made the words I'd been holding on to for weeks just come out. I told him about the job. I told him about the truck. I told him about the letter sitting on my coffee table and the 5-day deadline I couldn't figure my way out of. I told him things I hadn't even fully said out loud to myself yet, and I said them standing in my doorway in the same blazer I'd worn to 9 interviews. Walter set the casserole dish on my kitchen counter. He pulled out one of my chairs and sat down, and he listened to all of it without interrupting once. When I finished, the apartment was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think I might be able to help you, but not the way you're probably thinking." I didn't know what that meant, and I told him so. He leaned back in the chair and explained something about himself I hadn't known. Before retiring, Walter Fenn had spent 30 years working in workforce development, first as a job placement counselor for the state, then for a nonprofit that helped displaced workers find their footing after plant closures and mass layoffs. He had watched the construction and manufacturing sectors cycle through boom and bust enough times to recognize the pattern I was caught in, and he said it plainly. My applications were going into a cold market, and the approach I was using, applying broadly, applying broadly again, wasn't going to get me out in 5 days. He asked if he could see my resume. I almost said no. I don't know why exactly, except that letting someone read your resume feels strangely vulnerable when you're already feeling stripped down. But I pulled it up on my laptop and turned it toward him. He studied it for a few minutes without speaking. Then he nodded slowly and said, "You've got the right experience. You're just not talking to the right people." He explained that in construction and project management, especially in a regional market like Raleigh, most positions, especially the ones that got filled fast, never made it to the job boards at all. They got passed along through superintendents, subcontractors, people who worked with people who knew someone was looking. The apply and wait approach worked fine in stable markets. In a tight one, it was close to useless. Then he made the offer. He told me he still had contacts, people he had placed over the years who had moved into management, a few project directors at firms around the Triangle, a couple of general contractors he had worked with through the nonprofit. He couldn't promise anything, he said, and he was careful to say that. He wasn't dangling a guarantee in front of me, but he said if I was willing, he'd spend the next 2 days reaching out on my behalf. Personal calls, not emails, the kind that actually get returned. In exchange, he asked for one thing, and it was not what I expected. He asked me to come with him that Saturday to a community job fair he had been quietly helping to organize through his old nonprofit. They were short on volunteers with actual industry knowledge, people who could sit across from somebody and speak credibly about what the construction and skilled trade sectors were actually looking for. He said he wasn't asking me to run anything or take on any real commitment. Just a few hours, talking to people who were in the same position I was in 4 months ago. I sat with that for a second. I told him I wasn't sure I was the right person for that, given that I was still in the middle of my own mess. He looked at me steadily and said something that I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count since that afternoon. He said, "The fact that you're still in it is exactly what makes you the right person." The next 2 days felt different than anything in the previous 4 months. Not easier, not magically fixed, but different in the way that having traction feels different from spinning in place. Walter made calls that evening and the following morning. He sent me a text at one point that just said, "Be patient. This takes a day or two to work through channels." And somehow that mattered, knowing that something was actually moving, even when I couldn't see it. On the morning of day 5, the morning the bank's deadline technically arrived, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a project manager at a general contracting firm in Durham, a man named Craig Albright. He said Walter had reached out, that he had looked at my resume, and that he had a coordinator position that had just opened up due to an internal restructure. He wanted to know if I could come in that afternoon. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The interview lasted 45 minutes. It felt different from every other interview I'd had in the past 4 months. Less like I was auditioning, and more like I was having a conversation with someone who already had a rough sense of what I could do and wanted to fill in the specifics. Craig was straightforward, the kind of person who asked direct questions and seemed to actually listen to the answers rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. At the end of the interview, he told me the position started in 2 weeks and asked if that worked for me. I drove home with the windows down even though it was February and probably too cold for that, and I didn't care at all. I called the bank that evening. It turned out that with the job offer letter in hand, even pending, and a partial payment I scraped together from a few sources I had been too proud to ask sooner, I was able to negotiate a brief extension on the repossession timeline. The account was back in good standing within the first paycheck. It was not a movie moment. It was just paperwork and phone calls and the slow, undramatic process of getting solid ground back under your feet. But I'll take undramatic over what I'd been living with. That Saturday, I showed up at the community job fair. It was held in the gymnasium of a recreation center off South Saunders Street. Organized folding tables with printed signs. Volunteers in matching t-shirts, handing out resource packets near the door. Somewhere between 100 and 150 people cycled through during the hours I was there. Some were older workers who had been laid off from manufacturing jobs that weren't coming back. Some were recent graduates who couldn't get a first opportunity because every entry-level job wanted 2 years of experience they hadn't had a chance to get yet. Some were single parents trying to map out a second act around a school schedule. I sat at the construction and skilled trades table and I talked to every single person who came over. I told them what coordinators actually looked for in an application, which certifications were worth pursuing, which entry-level roles in the industry were realistic on-ramps, versus which ones were dead ends. I told them what the interview process usually looked like and what questions to be ready for. Small things, practical things. Things I would have wanted someone to tell me. A woman named Cherie came to my table twice. She had been working as an office manager at a small HVAC company that had closed, and she had project coordination experience she didn't realize translated as directly to construction as it did. I helped her reframe how she was describing herself on her resume, not inventing anything, just using the language the industry actually recognized, and I gave her 2 specific types of firms to target first. She came back a second time at the end of the fair just to say thank you, and she had that particular look in her eyes that I recognized. The look of someone who had been feeling invisible, finally feeling like someone had actually seen them. I know that look. I had been wearing it for 4 months. Walter was moving around the room all morning, checking in with other tables, coordinating with the nonprofit staff, doing the behind-the-scenes work that keeps something like that from unraveling at the seams. At one point, he stopped by my table, and I could tell from the way he was watching that he had been checking on me without making it obvious. I told him I thought I was starting to get the hang of this. He smiled in this way that made it clear he had known I would. The job at Craig's firm, Albright & Sons General Contracting, turned out to be the best professional fit I'd had since the internship at NC State. The team was smaller than my previous firm, which meant more ownership over each project, more direct contact with the people actually doing the work, more variety in a single week than I'd had in a year at the old place. The paycheck was steady, the hours made sense. I was good at the job and, maybe for the first time since the layoff, I remembered that I was actually good at it. I kept volunteering at the job fair. What started as a single Saturday became every quarter, then a more regular involvement with Walter's old nonprofit as they began hosting additional programming around resume workshops and industry-specific prep sessions. I was not running anything. I was not in charge of anything. I was just a person who showed up with practical knowledge and time, which it turned out was exactly what they needed. About 8 months after that afternoon in my doorway, a young guy came into one of the resume workshops I was helping facilitate. He was maybe 23, had just moved to Raleigh from a small town outside of Fayetteville, had done some rough framing work on residential builds, but never had it officially documented anywhere. He was applying for entry-level construction jobs and getting no responses, and he couldn't figure out why. I sat with him for an hour. We worked through what he actually knew how to do versus how he was describing it on paper. I told him which OSHA certification to prioritize and where to get it cheap. I told him which general contractors in the area were actively hiring entry-level crew members right now. I gave him the same kind of specific, actual-world guidance that Walter had given me. Not a pep talk, not motivation, just information and direction from someone who had recently been close enough to the ground to still remember what it looked like. 3 weeks later, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "This is Marcus from the workshop. I got the job. Thank you." I read that text standing in a parking lot on a Thursday afternoon, and I just stayed there for a moment, not doing anything in particular. I thought about the orange slip on my doormat, the casserole dish, the patient look on Walter's face while I said out loud all the things I'd been holding in, the way one quiet act of showing up, just showing up, with no dramatic gesture attached to it, had moved through so many other things in ways neither of us had planned. I'm 31 now. I've been at Albright & Sons for going on 3 years. Craig has become the kind of manager I hope to eventually be myself. The nonprofit recently expanded its programming to include a dedicated construction and skilled trades track, and I help coordinate it on a volunteer basis, which is a strange and satisfying thing to say out loud. The job fair that Walter had been quietly building for years now draws close to 300 people per event, but the part that stays with me, the part I still think about when I have a hard week or when the work gets frustrating or when I'm tempted to close in on myself and just push through alone, is the part that happened in a hallway. A retired man in his late 50s who had no particular reason to knock on my door, holding a tool bag and a dish his wife had made too much of, deciding that seeing someone wasn't doing well and doing nothing about it simply wasn't how he operated. He didn't fix my problem for me. He didn't hand me money or a contact list or a solution wrapped up with a bow on it. He just sat down at my kitchen table, listened without flinching, and then said, "I think I can help," and meant it in the plainest, most practical way. That's it. That's the whole thing. Before I wrap up, I want to ask you something I genuinely want to know. In the comments below, tell me where you're watching from, and if someone has ever shown up for you the way Walter showed up for me, I want to hear about it. Not the big dramatic gestures. The quiet ones. The ones where someone just decided to notice. The 5 days felt like the end of something, and they were. But they were also the beginning of something I could not have seen from where I was standing, holding an orange slip in a hallway, still wearing my interview blazer, still thinking I had to figure it all out alone. I didn't, and I'm glad someone reminded me of that.